Hey there, welcome to History Chats. Okay, let me switch over to, here we go. Yeah, so today we're talking about an interesting collection, and we joined by Brenna, who is our assistant archivist here and has been helping me process things as things come in for the archives. And recently we came across well, not came across, we had a donation of some letters that was a familiar name, and will maybe be familiar to many of you, but maybe not to us in the same way, because that's not necessarily the Duskey family haven't necessarily been a household name maybe for us growing up, but an interesting insight. And so yeah, I think I'll just kind of send it over. So this is a collection. I don't know. Do you want to talk a little bit about the collection itself before you get into or just what it consists of?
Yeah, so this is a collection of letters, basically, that Joe Duskey Jr. Has written over a span of a few years, about 1942 to 1945, during World War II, and his time in World War II, to his parents, and then also his sisters as well.
So letters back home.
Yeah,
Yeah, is part of
absolutely.
that. So we're going to take a look at some of the examples in letters and some of the stories that come out of it.
Yes.
Um, all right, I'm going to switch over to.
We can kind of start by talking about his service and how that kind of started. So, um, initially, Charles Dole, chairman of the National Ski Patrol Committee, offers to recruit experienced skiers and civilian volunteers who are already familiar with cold weather environments in ski patrol and winter warfare. So, in a place like Wisconsin, and especially in Wausau, when we have something like Rib Mountain, you can definitely see how maybe Joe, who was an avid skier, was familiar with not only obviously skiing, ski patrol, that sort of thing, but cold weather and wanting to stay in that sort of environment. Um, and then, especially with the wartime effort, wanting to play his part, especially as a young guy kind of coming out of high school. Um, for these civilian applicants, they had to submit three references attesting to their ability to operate in winter environments, including skills in mountaineering, rock climbing, or skiing. This was the first time a civilian organization was responsible for recruiting, screening, and approving applicants for military service, according to the National Association of the 10th Mountain Division, which was the division that Joe did eventually join. So between November 1941 and 1944, the organization had recruited more than 7,000 men for the division. And as the year 1941 turned into 42, Joe Duskey Jr., the man that you see here on your screen, or boy, at this time he's about 17 or 18 years old, so just kind of turning into a man. He was in his senior year of high school in Wausau, Wisconsin, here. But he had also applied for the 10th Mountain Infantry Division and left for Sun Valley, Idaho, in March of 1942. And by 1943, he was enlisted and on his way to the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Hale in Pando, Colorado. He spent almost all of 1943 training at Camp Hale, and eventually became a ski instructor for both the Mountain Training Group and the 10th Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop of the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment. So while at Camp Hale, he even worked in a ski repair shop, something that is, he said he enjoyed very much, something that was very near and dear to him, as he was talking in his letters, writing home to his mom and dad. It gave him an opportunity to spend some time with the guys in his company, and some of his friends that were there. He said he really liked working with the skis, learning how to repair them, that sort of thing. But also just an opportunity to hang out with his friends and do something that he enjoyed, which sounds quite characteristic of him, kind of based on some of his letters. So these pictures here that you see, one is the ski repair shop. Some of the guys hanging out there. Joe isn't in this picture, but some of the men in this picture were mentioned by name in some of his letters. And then the photo on the left is His eventual unit or company, the 10th Recon, it's just for them receiving mail. But another photo from their time at Camp Hale. So like I said, he spent almost all of 1943 training at Camp Hale, working in the ski shop. And then it looks like he then spends the beginning of 1944 in West Virginia. There he spends time training for mountain climbing. They have some sort of mountain climbing school, sounds like, based on his letters out there in West Virginia. And then the latter half of the year of 1944, he is in Camp Swift in Texas, where they're sent for some more flatland training, since obviously they've spent most of it doing mountain and winter warfare stuff in Colorado. So, and then in December of 1944, the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment is deployed to Naples, Italy, on the USS Argentine, arriving December 22nd in 1944. The 86th Regiment, including Joey, officially enters the front lines on January 8th, 1945, in the Mount Belvedere area of Italy. During January and part of February in 1945, the 86th Regiment was conducting mostly reconnaissance and combat patrols for an assault on Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere in the coming months. This was a ridge that the Americans or Allied forces were trying to take for several years and were unsuccessful because they were not trained in what they were calling winter warfare at the time, which is what the mountain troopers were kind of working on, which is, kind of the whole point of, why Joe was out there and what he was doing. So, then finally, the campaign for Riva Ridge was underway from February 18th to 25th, 1945. Joe Duskey Jr. was in Company E of the 86th Regiment and was designated to the reserves for this campaign, sparing him from direct campaign-related combat. But on March 3rd, 1945, that would change for Joey. March 3rd, 1945 was the first day of the campaign known as the March Offensive. With Mount della Terrazia secured, the division was ready to take the next step in its march to Po Valley, another important marker in the Italian front there. After a preliminary and costly thrust to the northeast, the main attack of the March Offensive jumps off on March 3rd at 7 a.m. From a line of departure on the flanks of Mount della Terrazia. The 86th 1st Battalion and 86th 2nd Battalion on the left, and the 87th 3rd Battalion on the right. Joe Duskey Jr. is in the 82nd 2nd Battalion, whose objective is to capture Mount Terminale and the village of Iola. By 7:47 a.m., Company E was reported halfway up Mount Terminale, and by 8:40 a.m., the peak had been secured completely. Company E was then faced with the difficult task of clearing the town of Iola, which lay in the path of the advance. All enemy resistance in the town was eventually destroyed. 30 prisoners were taken, including a German battalion commander and his staff. The cost to Company E, unfortunately, was terrific. Almost an entire platoon was killed or wounded, and unfortunately, this did include Joe Duskey Jr., who was killed in action on Mount Terminale that day in Italy at 21 years old. So this is why we only have letters from Joey up until March of 1945. So that is Joe's story, kind of his overall. But what's really interesting and very neat about these letters is that he was really able to give us an insight into kind of like the young person's story and experience in training, and not just overseas, but when still at home. He did have a few pretty interesting stories and anecdotes that he had in his letters that he wrote to his parents and to his sister. He liked to talk about the classes that they were taking when learning about camouflage in the snow. One time he was quoted saying, "Their white uniforms hidden in the snow, and it was our job to spot them, but it was almost impossible to distinguish between them and the snow." Then it gave all of us a great deal of confidence towards the type of fighting we were being trained to do. That's why it's so important to spot the enemy first and get him with the first shot, because you probably won't be able to get in a second, because you'll have given away your position to the enemy, and that's the reason we will take much good care of our sweethearts, because they'll mean life and death to us. So some of these stories are very reminiscent, very telling, especially kind of knowing his end. It makes kind of his story a little harder to read, but also insightful, and I think kind of tells the greater story of just the general man, I think, in World War II as well, and just an insight into some of that. And then, and it's not all sad and grim and stuff as well. He did have a few funnier anecdotes. There was one incident where he did end up kind of sick when he was in Camp Hale. He did come down with some scarlet fever. It was okay. He came out of it. So that's not the funny part. He did come out. He was okay at the end. And he ended up being in quarantine for longer than he was happy about. And so at the end there, when he was feeling a lot better and he didn't want to be in the hospital anymore, he decided that he wanted to put mineral oil on his legs to hide the peeling from scarlet fever that some of the other men were suffering from, so he could get out of the hospital quicker, because that would usually keep you in quarantine for longer, because it was kind of proof that you had the disease. So instead of being kept for a few more days, he decided that he was not going to do that, and he was going to figure out a tricky way to get out of that quarantine, and decided that he was going to trick the doctor and put some oil on his legs, and got himself out of the hospital a few days early. And he decided to write home to mom and dad about it and brag about how smart and clever he was. And at that point, he wasn't feeling sick anymore. It's just kind of like some residual stuff. But, he was a boy that I think, unfortunately, was kind of put into an adult situation, and it made him grow up faster than maybe everyone has to. But
and it also speaks to the candor.
Absolutely.
He's not getting. He's willing and happy to talk about that sort of thing, which I know you were saying is interesting, in that the way that he speaks feels very, again, gives insight into the character, that he's happy to tell the story. He's a storyteller. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he was very happy to tell his parents that he was tricking the doctor, and his sister Jill was a nurse at the time at Johns Hopkins, and he was very excited to write to his sister, who was a nurse, and tell her that he had tricked this doctor into thinking that he had magically cured himself of scarlet fever, and so now he no longer had scarlet fever, but he had some other disease instead, and so he let him out early. And so it's just that kind of like jovial sort of, storytelling, that kind of prankster sort of mentality just kind of gives you an insight into who he was, and that, like it's not all horrible, death. And it's also not typical of all letters that we get.
Exactly.
We have a lot of examples of other letters back from, training, and it's not nearly as colorful.
Yep, exactly. He really found a way to make his mark. So he also, in his time at Camp Hale, was filmed for a movie by Columbia Pictures and Warner Bros. They made a movie on the Mountain Troopers. This includes some footage of Joe skiing down the mountain. At least that's what he writes home to mom and dad. It's not, you can't quite disprove it. Yeah, so he wrote home to his mom and dad, letting them know that they needed to check out the movie The Mountain Fighters, produced by Columbia Pictures and Warner Bros. In the theater, because it featured him skiing down the mountain through some trees and some snow. He made it very clear to them that they would not be able to pick him out because they're all bundled up and going quite quickly down the mountain. But very cool nonetheless. And I think pretty neat that, he got to be in something like that, and he'll, live on forever and in a pretty cool,
Possibly, yeah.
pretty cool film like that. So if you want to watch it, it's on YouTube.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the description. Why
not? In the early days of Joe being in Camp Hale in Colorado, and I do reference this a lot. One, because I haven't gotten quite through all the letters yet. There are a lot of them. It's about 4 years worth of letters, so I haven't quite made it through quite all of them. But also because I feel that this is kind of when he seems to be enjoying himself the most, and this is kind of a good example of that. He writes to his mom and dad on February 4th of 1943. He writes, "I'm doing the things I like to do now, and that means a great deal to me in this. Thus far, we have had drilling on skis, bushwhacking, skiing through the pines and deep powder snow, loads of fun, type of skiing we will have to do if in combat." He mentions that they had ski instructors from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland. He was very excited. He started mentioning many of his instructors by name, usually because they had some sort of importance or were of usually a lot of talent. He mentions Prane and Robinson, Goodman, Rideout, Zobash. If you're into skiing, you might recognize some of those names. I know that they, some held records, some were ski coaches for colleges. I know there was the head coach of the Dartmouth ski team at one point was also a ski instructor in the 10th Mountain Infantry Division. So, and then he also bragged multiple times in many letters about getting compliments from many of these ski instructors. And I know that he loved his time as a ski instructor as well when he was at Camp Hale. So that's kind of why I like to focus on when he was there, because he seemed to really enjoy, I think, that chapter the most. But yeah, so that's kind of a peek, I think, into this collection of letters, and a peek into Joe's life and who he was as a person. Very brief, obviously, but a peek nonetheless.
I guess in to kind of wrap it up a little bit. Here, let me put my microphone on so you can hear me a little better. I guess one thing that and you meant a little bit about the connections, home. Unfortunately, Joe Jr. did die during the course of the war, but certainly his legacy does carry on. And we're really going to get into the specifics of, the full. I'm talking. Get into the full specifics of like the Joe Duskey Club, which was a sort of big thing in the high school, or even like the ski, the legacy in terms of downhill skiing, which is of course big. But I don't know, did you want to talk just briefly about the his father kind of carries it on, right?
Yeah. So after reading some of the letters, kind of starting in the beginning, really, his dad, it seems, wasn't terribly into skiing. I'm not sure if he didn't know how to ski at all, or if he just wasn't an avid skier like Joe Jr. was. But I can tell you that Joe Jr. was a little upset with his dad per the letters because Joe Sr. decided to pick up skiing after Joe Jr. had enlisted and had kind of found out that, his son was joining the mountain troopers and was going to do this sort of brand new thing in winter warfare and was going to be, like a ski soldier, basically. So he decided to pick up skiing and learn skiing. I think kind of in what to me seems like, in reminder of his son, or
maybe get an experience.
To know what it's like, and to see, to maybe feel a little more connected since he's not home and he's gone. And while letters are great, maybe that's not always enough. Yeah. And I know that Joe Jr. wrote several times that he was like, why didn't you learn to do this when I was home? Like, we could have gone skiing together. And he oftentimes wrote to his dad about skiing, and many letters are just conversations about skiing and just, shop talk, basically, about the technical ski terms and and how to ski and what to do and what not to do. And so, for example, this is one of the letters that he wrote to his mom and dad. Looks like this is dated June 1st. He wrote this obviously later in the evening. He was writing about some of the things they had done that day, or at least during that week, learning how to mountain climb, different techniques, different maneuvers. As you can see in the letter here, there are some drawings. He kind of sketches this out. One of them is like a inchworm kind of caterpillar maneuver, where you have your hands and feet pulling you across on a rope between two different peaks. And then the other one is basically when you're rappelling down like the side of a cliff or a mountain. But it's just kind of an example of him basically showing, trying to explain these techniques to his parents, or, people back home. He often wrote his sister Jill as well, just kind of trying to give them some insight into what he was doing, at Camp Hale and when he was away. So especially, just casual skiing versus obviously what Joe Jr. is doing, skiing for potential combat situations or skiing for more like, alpine sort of things versus maybe casual
sporting.
More more casual, Granite Peak skiing, like that maybe Joe Sr. was doing. But
he does carry on the tradition. Yes. And that is, again, maybe our generation is not as connected to that, but I'm sure many of the people watching this will know of Joe Duskey because of the legacy of the ski hill and the programs the races and all of that stuff that have carried on. So I guess in conclusion, we'll maybe call it there, but certainly a lot more that we'll go through. This often happens when you get a donation. Well, I shouldn't say it often. This is kind of an unusual situation, but certainly, stuff comes in and we get to experience some of the stories, and sometimes it's kind of fun to share those. So thank you, Brenna, for coming on and sharing some of the insights into him through his life. And I guess thank you for watching, and we will see you next time for some more History Chats.